Yesterday, Facebook reminded me of a post I had put on Facebook 10 years ago. And it said, life is not a straight line leading from one blessing to the next, and then finally to heaven. Life is a winding and troubled road. God is not just showing up after the trouble and cleaning up. He is plotting the course and managing the troubles with far-reaching purposes for our good and for the glory of Jesus Christ. It's a quote by John Piper. And this quote describes the life of Joseph to a T. I like the story of Joseph. And it's a story I get to read every year. And it never ceases to, first of all, amaze me and also to challenge me about how I'm living my life. The story of Joseph is, in the Bible, it's not really a biography. We don't get details. We get glimpses of what's going on, and many parts of Joseph's life are missing. We are not told what he was feeling. We are not given his day-by-day life. It's not a blow-by-blow account. We have to imagine some of the things that may have been happening in Joseph's life. But what we know is that all along the crooked line of Joseph's life, God was there. God was not showing up after Joseph had been in trouble, but God was there plotting, as Piper says, plotting the course of Joseph's life and managing Joseph's troubles with far-reaching purposes for Joseph's good and for God's glory. God is always there. He may not be overtly, we don't see him all the time in Joseph's life, but he is there. When we first hear of Joseph, he's having dreams. The Bible does not even tell us that God gave him the dream. It just tells us that Joseph had a dream, or let's say he had a couple of dreams. And then we also see Jacob sending Joseph to go check on his brothers in the flock. And he told Joseph, go to Shechem, where your brothers are taking care of the flock, and see how they are doing. And Joseph went to Shechem, and he didn't find them. If Joseph had just gone home, the story would have been different. If he had just gone home and told his dad, I went, they were not there. But some random person, as in, found him and that, oh, who are you looking for? And Joseph says, I'm looking for my brothers. And then this random person that we don't even know their name says, oh, I heard them say that they're going to Dothan. With that one statement, Joseph's life was set on a different path. Joseph did not know what was going on. We know because we've read the story. But Joseph was totally clueless about what was happening. He was just about to enter this horrifying story that he would live one confusing day after another. And then Joseph goes to Dothan to look for his brothers. And while he's still afar off, the brothers say, let's kill him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. And even at that point, God spares Joseph's life. Because when they discuss, oh, let's not kill him, he's our brother. So they decide instead to throw him in the pit. And so they throw him in. He's pleading with them. They do nothing. But Reuben has decided in his heart that he's going to save Joseph and take him back home. And then it so happens that when the Midianites are passing by, Reuben is not there. I don't know where he's gone off to, because by the time Reuben comes back, Joseph has been sold. Joseph doesn't know the story. We know the story because we have read to the end. But Joseph just knows that he's been sold. And I don't know what Joseph was thinking as he was walking down to Egypt. I don't know if he was put on a caravan or they were walking on foot or they were tied as they walked to Egypt. But I don't know the prayers that were going on in Joseph's heart and mind. Was he pleading with God? Was he hoping for some miraculous rescue? Or that maybe another band of raiders will come and there'll be confusion and I can run away? The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what was going on, but we know that Joseph Maybe, I don't even, because the first time we meet him, he's 17. We don't know how many years have passed. Maybe it's just within that period of time. So he's a young man. So he's wondering, will I ever go back home? And I can imagine the fear. Yesterday, we didn't come to work because there were riots. But I can imagine Joseph in a strange place with strange people, not knowing what his future was going to be like. God was still at work. Joseph did not know it. We know it because we read it, but Joseph did not know. Did he try to escape? Did he? We just have to imagine. Then they fika Egypt, and I don't know if there's a slave market, but he's there. Because anyone could have bought Joseph. There could have been a rich businessman from Assyria or from Babylon who could have bought Joseph. But God did not allow anyone else to buy Joseph apart from Potiphar. And not just any other person in Egypt. He could have been bought by a farmer who would go far to some small village. But God made sure that Joseph was bought by Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. God was at work. We know that he was at work, but Joseph didn't know. So Joseph goes to Potiphar's house. He has the job of maybe cleaning the house, taking care of business in the house. But I wonder, at night, when everyone was asleep, did Joseph beg God, please let me go home? Please let me go home. Because you are loved by your father, you have your younger brother, Benjamin. And later we know that Joseph really cared, because when the brothers come, he wants to know how Benjamin is. So Joseph is missing his family. So at night, is he crying out to God and saying, God, please just let me go home? Is he crying? Is he praying? Is he asking God to intervene in his life? And therefore, something that blows my mind is that Joseph did his work well at Potiphar's house. Like, I'm a slave, I was brought here illegally, and he does his work well. In fact, he does his work so well that Potiphar is impressed. And Potiphar is so impressed that he puts Joseph in charge of his household. And the Lord blessed Joseph, the Lord blessed Potiphar's house because of the presence of Joseph. So it wasn't just that God was with Joseph, but Joseph was with God. He was living his life in such a way that it could be shown that this person is different from other people. That's why Potiphar trusted him. That's why Potiphar made him in charge of his household. And then, opportunity to sin happened in the form of Mrs. Potiphar, like something out of a South American soap opera. And Joseph turns it down. Joseph is a young man, he's in his 20s. Away from home, no one knows him here. But he refuses an opportunity to sleep with Mrs. Potiphar. You know, Joseph could have said, who would know? Who will know? And first of all, nothing has been going right in my life. So what's the big deal? I'll sleep with her. But Joseph's reason is, how can I sin against God? It's not that, how can I sin against? Okay, he was concerned about Potiphar himself. But he says, but his main reason for not sleeping with Potiphar's wife is because he did not want to sin against God. And so she cries rape. And Potiphar believed his wife's accusation of Joseph. Can you imagine Joseph looking into Potiphar's eyes and thinking, your wife approached me. I could have slept with her and he wouldn't even have known. And yet Potiphar decides to send Joseph to prison. God was at work in Joseph's life. We know that. Joseph doesn't. So he's taken to the prison where the king's prisoners also would be confined. That's in verse 20. And yet we find that even in prison, God is with Joseph. And the people around him can see that something about him is different. The prison warden gives him charge of the jail. He's in charge of everything. And God was with Joseph in prison, but Joseph was also with God. Joseph wasn't complaining because I'm thinking of myself. If I'm in prison for something I did not do, I'm not happy. I am not happy. I'm complaining, or not even if I'm not complaining, but I'm not talking. My face would show that I'm not happy to be here. And yet, Joseph, because when you read a few verses later, when Pharaoh's servants have been put in jail, he wakes up one morning and he's like, "Why are your faces so sad?" I'm like, Joseph, I'm the one who would be sad. I wouldn't even be concerned about the faces of the other prisoners. I'd be sad about my own situation. And yet here is Joseph being concerned about the faces of the cupbearer and the face of the baker. Joseph is a way better person than I am. Because if I was in that much trouble, I would be thinking of myself. But we see that even in this situation, God is leading Joseph. God is giving him wisdom, and God is getting him closer to where Joseph is supposed to be. And we can even see when Joseph responds to the dreams that the cupbearer and the baker had, Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" As in, you tell me your dream, I'll ask God to give me the interpretation to give you. So Joseph has a relationship with God here in prison, and it's a good relationship. And he's not angry, he's not depressed. He's living out his life in a bad place, knowing, I don't even know what Joseph knows and what he doesn't know, but I'm amazed at how he's interacting with people. And so when he interprets the dreams, they come out exactly the way he had said they would come out. And then he asks the cupbearer, "Remember me and show me kindness," in chapter 40, verse 14 to 15. And he says, "Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." That verse tells me that Joseph wanted to go home. It's not that he was so comfortable in his confinement that he was fine. In his heart, he wanted to go home. And so he tells this guy, "Please remember me when you go to Pharaoh and say a good word for me." But the cupbearer did not remember. Verse 23 tells us, he did not remember Joseph, he forgot him. God was at work. That was divine forgetfulness. Because the cupbearer Joseph could not be released. God could not answer Joseph's prayer at that time. So the cupbearer goes and forgets. But I can imagine Joseph, maybe after the cupbearer has been released, that day, maybe he's seated in prison saying, "Maybe today, word will come that I can go home." And then word does not come. Then tomorrow. Then at the end of the week, he's saying, maybe the cupbearer is still getting back into business. Maybe next week. Then maybe next month. Then maybe 2 months. But it went on and on for 2 years. So I don't know what Joseph felt. His hopes, his dreams, his prayers were not being answered. And I don't know what is going on in his mind. Is he angry at God? God was at work. We know that, even though Joseph didn't. Joseph could not get his prayer answered that time, and we know why, because we've read the end of the story. Pharaoh hadn't had his dream, and as long as Pharaoh hadn't had his dream, Joseph could not go, because God had a plan in place. So, and the issue about Joseph being in Egypt and having to stay in Egypt for God's plans, the future of nations depended on Joseph being in Egypt. God had something to teach Egypt, God had something to teach Israel, and God had something to teach the Amorites back in Canaan. And all those things depended on Joseph remaining in Egypt. So even though Joseph was praying and praying and praying, God's purposes were different from what Joseph was praying for. And God's purposes needed to be accomplished. So when Pharaoh had his dream, 2 years later, Joseph was able to help interpret that dream. And when everything fell into place finally, and Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for food, and they were worried about, when they discovered who Joseph was, they were worried about the fact that he would hold it against them, what they had done to him earlier. In Genesis chapter 45, verse 5, verse 7, and verse 8, Joseph says something. He tells his brothers, "Do not be distressed and do not be angry at yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Joseph finally sees what God's plan was all along. And even later, after his father dies and the brothers are worried about, will Joseph now take his revenge against us? Was he just being kind because dad was still alive? Joseph tells them, "You intended harm to me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." If I can go back to the quote that Piper wrote that I read earlier, it says, "Life is not a straight line leading from one blessing to the next and finally to heaven. Life is a winding, troubled road. And God is not just showing up at the end after the trouble and cleaning up. He is plotting the course and managing the troubles with far-reaching purposes for our good and for the glory of Jesus Christ." What does your life look like today? Is there pain? Is there sadness? Are you facing injustice? Have you prayed and prayed for something and nothing seems to happen? It was almost 20 years before Joseph was reunited with his family. Abraham, we know, waited for a son for 25 years. This afternoon, do you feel like God has forgotten you? Or maybe even this morning you got some bad news, so you're here and your heart is heavy because you have received bad news. How would your life look today? Or how would my life, I'm speaking also to myself, if I looked at every situation that I face as God actively plotting the course of my life? But everything that I go through is God actively plotting the course of my life. How would my attitude change if I believe that even the troubles that plague my life have far-reaching purposes for my good and for the glory of Jesus Christ? And you're here this afternoon, you have burdens that you come to lay at the feet of Jesus. What difference does knowing that whatever it is that you're going through is not hidden from God, that He's actually plotting things, far-reaching purposes for your good and for His glory? I think that would totally revolutionize our lives as Christians if we believed that whatever is happening in our lives is happening in God's hands. And it's not something that, it's not that, oh God, it's happening to me. Yes, it's happening to me, but it's happening to me in God's hands. And God has a far-reaching purpose for my good and for His glory. So let's pray.